This thing is massive. But hey, I'm not gonna judge you if you wanna play with it. We're gonna be going over the installation of an INFERNO Gen 2 HPA conversion kit on an M249 and M240 style gearbox on today's episode of What the Tech. Future Glenn here. There's a few things that I want to mention before we get into this. The first one is that if you're working on an M249, your gearbox will probably look a little bit more like this. And even though the installation is going to be very similar to mine, it's just worth knowing. One other thing, as you'll see later in the video, is that I ran my airline out under the back of my stock. I only was able to do this with a longer airline than the one that comes in the kit. So there's plenty of other options that'll work well for you, but it's worth knowing before you try to go to all the trouble of doing it, that without a longer airline, it might not be the best spot for you. Let's get back into it. First, we're just going to go ahead and break this thing down. One thing to note is that depending on your setup, your breakdown until this point could look very different from mine. But now that we have the gearbox out, let's go ahead and break it down too. Let's start by pulling off the motor cage. And now we'll just go ahead and unscrew all the little screws all the way around. Next, we'll pull the slide off the top. Next, we're going to remove this pin on the back here. Tap it very gently, and the whole thing should come apart. Next, we're just going to set all these old internals to the side. We'll want to hold on to the screws that I took out in the beginning and the motor cage. Next, I'm going to take the two halves of the gearbox and punch out the old bearings. The next thing to do is go ahead and clean out all the old grease from your gearbox. Now that we got most of the grease out, I'm just going to go ahead and get some isopropyl alcohol. And just make sure this is all nice and clean before I put in the new electronics in the engine. Next, I'm just going to go ahead and take apart the motor cage, pull off the old wiring. You might need a pair of snips or something if your wires are soldered onto the trigger switch. Just get it as clean as you can. Now pull the switch off the back of the cage, and we can just separate the two halves and pull out the motor. Now I'm just going to go ahead and reassemble the cage without the motor in it. Just like so. Now that everything's disassembled and cleaned, we can go ahead and get the engine ready to install. First, we'll grab the airline, carefully thread it into the back of the engine. Now you'll want to get a 1/4 inch wrench and just gently snug it down. Don't over tighten it. Now we'll just go ahead and place the engine in the gearbox. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and take the wiring harness and feed the solenoid wire through the middle hole in the motor cage, like so. Then I'll grab the airline and feed it through the same hole. Now that we have all that ready to go, I'll plug in the solenoid wire. And then we'll just want to make sure that it's tucked somewhere out of the way so when you screw the two halves together, it doesn't get pinched. Now we'll put the second half of the gearbox back on and slide it all together. Next, I'll go ahead and screw the two screws for the motor cage back in. And then I'll just put in the rest of the screws that go around. Remember to double check that you're not pinching any wires before you tighten everything down. The next thing to do is take your two wires that come off your wiring harness here, the two pink ones, and plug them into the same pins on the switch that the gun was using before we stripped everything out of the gearbox. Next, I'm just going to go ahead and take the FCU, plug in the wiring harness, and we'll test to see if our electronics are working. And they are. Last, I'll take this slide that was on the top, slide it back onto the gearbox, and that is a complete gearbox assembly. One thing to notice is that on my gearbox, once it was all screwed together, the engine still had a lot of play in it. So what we can do to fix this is just pull it all apart. Then we just wrap a small piece of electrical tape around this black part of the engine. Now we can just go ahead and screw it all back together. And now there's no play in the engine. This won't happen on all gearboxes, but it happened to mine. Now that the gearbox is all back together, we'll get ready to put it back in the gun. Now we'll just go ahead and install the gearbox. Be careful not to pinch any wires while you're sliding it all inside. Now we'll just reassemble the gun the same way it came apart. I modified this stock slightly so the airline just comes out the back there. We'll go ahead and open up the dust cover, install the FCU, tuck that all back inside, making sure not to pinch the wires, and close it up. And that's it. That's the install of a Gen 2 Inferno HPA conversion kit in an M249 and M240 style gearbox. If you're going to be using an aftermarket TCU kit to control your box mag, you can find that video linked down below. If you found this video useful, don't forget to give it a like, maybe go check out the channel for other great content just like this, and we'll see y'all out in the field.